Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Nasher's 360 Speaker Series. I'm Lee Arnold, Assistant Curator here at the Nasher, and today it is my very distinct pleasure and honor to introduce artist Judy Chicago. Judy Chicago is a feminist artist, author, educator, and intellectual. For over 5 decades, she has remained steadfast in her commitment to the power of art as a vehicle for intellectual transformation and social change, and to women's right to engage in the highest levels of art production. As a result, she has become a symbol for people everywhere, known and respected as an artist, writer, teacher, and humanist whose work and life are models for an enlarged definition of art, an expanded role for the artist, and women's right to freedom of expression. One of the most important artists of her generation, Chicago pioneered feminist art through her groundbreaking program for women at Cal State Fresno in the early 1970s. Her most well-known work, The Dinner Party, a sculptural installation comprising ceramics and textiles in a powerful reclamation of over 30 centuries of women's history, has been seen by over 1 million people in 16 exhibitions across 6 countries. Other work by Chicago examines the Holocaust, power and powerlessness, birth and creation, and so much more. As new generations of women commit to reinvigorating feminism, Chicago's wisdom and relevance is impossible to ignore. In 2018, she was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people, as well as one of the year's most influential artists by Artsy. Chicago's work is held in collections worldwide, including the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, the National Gallery, SF MoMA, and Tate London, among many others. Chicago's work has been the subject of several recent solo exhibitions at the Pasadena Museum of Art, Institute of Contemporary Art, Miami, and the Jessica Silverman Gallery, San Francisco. This year, Chicago will open solo exhibitions at the National Museum for Women in the Arts, Washington, D.C., and Jeffrey Deitch, Inc., Los Angeles. Joining Chicago in conversation is writer and sociologist of art and culture, Dr. Serra Thornton. No stranger to the Nasher, Thornton moderated one of the most raucous panel discussions the Nasher has ever presented on artists and the art market in 2016. She has written extensively on the art world and contemporary art for the Sunday Times Magazine, The Guardian, The New Statesman, The New Yorker, Art Forum, and the Art Newspaper. She is currently a contributing editor of Cultured Magazine and is perhaps best known for her 2 highly successful and enjoyable books about the art world and artists' lives, 7 Days in the Art World from 2009 and 33 Artists in 3 Acts from 2014. Recently, Serra contributed to the forthcoming publication, Judy Chicago, New Views. Today, Thornton and Chicago will discuss the artist's 50-year history with 3D forms, from Chicago's biomorphic ceramic and acrylic works from the early 1960s, to her hard-edge minimalist forms, to her turn to environmental earthworks in the 1970s. Their conversation promises to be an enlightening and in-depth look at Chicago's incredibly diverse and significant career in sculpture. Please join me in welcoming Judy Chicago and Serra Thornton.
Thank you, Lee. It's a great pleasure to be here. I love the Nasher. It's such a special place. And thank you very much, Lee. Thank you to the amazing Jeremy Strick and to Anna Smith, who's head of education here. It was very hard to curate some slides for this talk because Jessica's sculptural output is huge. Sorry, Judy's.
I give a lot of credit to my dealer.
Except that she wasn't born when these works were made, some of them. Where was I then?
How hard
do you like my shoes? I'll just distract you for a minute. But the, let's see. Yes, because Judy's sculptural output is so diverse. So in the end, actually, some of the early biomorphic abstractions from the early 60s got cut out of the slideshow, so I hope I don't disappoint anyone. There's just so much to talk about. And I want to, we are going to try to, I tried to curate around a theme of 3D liberation, but actually that probably pertains to almost all your sculpture. So we're going to start in 1965 with Sunset Squares. And it may be hard to see on the slide, but this is a multicolor work, 4 different shades. Can you just tell us about your thinking? What went on? How did you come to make Sunset Squares?
Well, the whole period of the 60s and my turn away from any art that revealed my gender led me to make a lot of big scale sculpture. Including Sunset Squares. We're going to look at some other. This period of my work was almost erased until the Getty's Pacific Standard Time in 2011 and 12. For those of you who don't know what that was, is there anybody here who doesn't know what that was? Pacific Standard Time was this huge undertaking funded by the Getty in LA that involved institutions from Santa Barbara to San Diego, all documenting and celebrating Southern California art from 1965 to 1980. And I was in LA working during that period. And even though the LA art scene of the early 60s was unbelievably inhospitable to women, there was a spirit of self-invention there then, and also something I was talking to Jeremy about last night, the lack of market pressure. There was no art market. Nobody thought about in LA then. Nobody thought they would ever make money as an artist. That wasn't the point of making art. The point of making art was to be taken seriously. And I learned very quickly, first in graduate school, and then when I merged from graduate school into the LA art scene, that I wouldn't be taken seriously if my work revealed that it was made by a woman. I tell this to young women that they can't believe it. The biggest compliment you could get then was to be told that your work looked like it was made by a man. So I tried. I tried. But I was a failed man.
But there are some, when I saw this work in person at the ICA Miami, I found it funny because the hints of color, those pastel, feminine shades are funny, right? When you're in dialogue with a kind of...
With Richard Serra?
and Saul LeWitt, or there was...
At least Saul. Saul got into color at the end of his life. Richard, not. Black, brown, rust. I think the important thing about this is that in retrospect, it seems clear why this work was so radical and why I couldn't get anywhere with it and why I had to destroy so much of it because I couldn't afford to store it. And what's so great is that it's being brought back, first for ICA, then for this big show of my early work that's going to open in September at Jeffrey Deitch's new gallery in LA, which is like the most beautiful space. It's like 12,000 square feet. And my early work will easily fill it because I've just made so much work.
So 2 more sculptures made in the same year. Rainbow Picket, which actually was shown in New York in a very important show called Primary Structures, curated by Kiniston McShine. Probably no accident that he's African American and perhaps was desired to include an outsider like a woman. I believe you were the only woman in that show?
There were 4 women out of 82 men.
Right, sorry.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Which in those days, that was a pretty high average. Really, they used to call them, one-man shows for a reason. And
then Trinity here on the right from 1965. I'm intrigued. How did Trinity survive? Because Rainbow Picket, despite its kind of illustrious provenance of having shown, ended up being destroyed as well.
I destroyed 10-part cylinders, which is going to be recreated for Jeffrey's show. Sunset Squares and Rainbow Picket, because they were just too big to store. But I remember sort of thinking to myself, maybe someday there'll be some interest in this period of my work, and so I should try and save some selected works, and Trinity was one of them. I don't know exactly, I can't remember why I picked that one, but I mean, I was so, I was so kind of naive and idealistic when I was a young artist, and in fact, I often talk about the fact that I saw everything through a gender lens, and so all the rejections that I experienced and the lack of understanding, I was sure it was because I was a woman, and part of that was true, but there was another part that I didn't appreciate for a very long time, which was I was treated like shit. But I couldn't imagine that the men were being treated like that too and accepting it. I didn't understand that artists, by and large, are treated very badly.
Tell me a bit about your rainbow palette. I mean, today we associate it very much with, gay pride, LGBTQ rights. And was that the case then? Why were you drawn to?
No, I just was always drawn to color. And, in fact, that was, when you talk about return of the repressed, I mean, that was one of the things I tried to do, was repress my color sense. Because when I was at UCLA, my male painting teachers hated my color. Oh my God, they hated my color. So I tried to pull it back, but it kept coming back. So that was a very good title, Serra. That's just the kind of color I like, pinks and lavenders and ivory and turquoise. And at UCLA in the 60s, the dominant palette was shaped by an artist from LA who nobody knows, I'm sure here, called Rico Lebrun and Nathan Oliveira. And they liked olive green, burnt sienna,
ochre.
Ochre, oh, big on ochre.
The hippie palette.
Raw umber, burnt umber, dark umber. Actually, when I designed the t-shirt for Max Mara, it was like a throwback because they had the same damn colors in their palette they wanted me to use.
So let's talk about your atmospheres, in which you used colored smoke, which I think was made with sugar.
Now it's made with sugar. It wasn't then. Now it's made with sugar and
baking soda?
No. Potassium chloride, right, Donald? Yeah, potassium. This is my husband, photographer Donald Woodman. He's the one who came in and bossed the sound tech around. Much to the sound tech guy's consternation, I had to say, don't mind him, he's my husband. He bosses everybody around. Anyway,
so how did you...
I'm really thrilled that there's so much interest now in my fireworks because at the time, I started doing them in the late 60s at a time that's just inconceivable now, where my friends and I I just bought fireworks and we just went out to beaches, deserts, national forests, and ignited the fireworks. And people took pictures and made, like Super 8 films. And I slowly got some amount of support for it, but again, I couldn't get enough support. I always thought large. Also, the thing about my career, and it's interesting that you're looking at sculpture, is that I've gone back and forth from 2 to 3 dimensions throughout my career. In fact, I got my master's in painting and sculpture because I had moved into the sculpture department where there was more support than in the chauvinistic painting department. When my first book, Through the Flower, came out, there was this professor from UCLA I ran into, and he came up to me, he talked in this really hoarse voice, and he said, "Judy, I'm not a male chauvinist. And I'm like, really? You should tell that to all the young women who suffered. I mean, really, it was a time when the male professors didn't take women students seriously. They saw them as a potential bedmates, not potential serious artists. All the young women painted just like the professor. It was like really, truly obnoxious.
Your atmospheres, I mean, these for me seem kind of witchy in the most positive way. I use the word enchanted up there because Shakespeare and double boil and trouble, you know, like Macbeth quotes, misheard, kind of come to mind. Tell us who you were reacting against in part. I've put up the Smithson and Serra slide.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think, let's look at them, because I thought that was really interesting that you put them in. I mean, I knew, you know, I was in LA, and so a lot of the minimal work and land art that was going on in other parts, you know, it's not like now where everybody knows what everybody's doing. You can go on Instagram and look at work from all over the world. It wasn't like that. There was a huge divide between the East Coast and the West Coast. But Richard Serra came to LA. You'd already
started doing the atmospheres,
my fireworks came out of a whole different impulse, not a reaction. In fact, not much of my work has been a reaction, except the dinner party was definitely a reaction to my having learned that women had never made any contributions, but to Western civilization or to European thought. I mean, that was definitely a reaction. I'm like, really? I just, you know, I set out to find out if that was true, and I discovered like thousands of books that contradicted that idea. Anyway, but Richard Serra came to Pasadena. He had a show at the Pasadena Museum where I had a studio where I was working. In fact, that's where I did all the big sculptures. And he had cut down all these redwoods cut down and piled in the center of the museum, and I was really horrified. Horrified. You know, I'd already been, for the last couple of years, doing these smoke pieces in which I was trying to soften and feminize and merge with the landscape. And I was just, so I said something to him at the opening, and the next morning I was in my studio, which had a big center staircase, and I heard this pounding on the door, and I went downstairs, and there was Richard Serra with art form in his hand, and he's like waving it. He said, well, you may not like it, but they do. I mean, it is only really recently that people have even begun to look at this alternative way of dealing with the earth. Lee was telling me last night that she's working on a show of female land artists. There was no language for that. There was no language in the 1960s. And so even though I was doing these pieces, and I did quite a few of them, between 1968 and 1974 when I stopped, I think I did 30. And, but they were mostly small scale. The biggest piece I did was the last one in 1974 when the Oakland Museum commissioned me to do a piece as part of their City of the Sculpture in the City. I did it was the first time I tried to make an image with fireworks. It was called A Butterfly for Oakland.
It's beautiful.
Then I had to stop, and it was the only direction. But my original impulse had nothing to do with Richard Serra or Robert Smithson. My original impulse came from the fact that I was involved in these elaborate color systems to kind of figure out how to use my color sense and harness it to convey emotive states. And my color was like locked into either these minimal sculptures or paintings or then domes. And looking back, I can see that this preceded my making a radical change in my art making and going to Fresno. I can see that these were a real gesture of liberation, but they were particularly started by a piece I did with some other artists on New Year's Eve, because I was always interested in collaboration. I did a lot of collaborations. I organized a lot of artist events in a park in Pasadena. And this was an artist event in the street for which I lined the street with fog machines. So there was this fog, and there were we put these big Klieg lights. It was for New Year's Eve when all these people were on the street for the Rose Bowl the next morning. And I still remember it. I made color wheels for the Klieg lights, and the Klieg lights were pointing up, and the fog was wafting up, and it turned the fog into color. And I'm like, I'm going to do fireworks. I saw this color in the air, transforming and getting rid of the horrible patriarchal environment. I was hooked.
And I won't ask you a question about it because we're going to skip forward to the Mother Goddess, but just to note that you have resumed making different kinds of atmospheres, often commissioned by museums in more urban settings, such as Be No More, which reveals the word truth out of dry ice.
Yeah.
But we are going to move.
Sarah's worried
to,
about time. I never pay
just,
attention to schedules, but Sarah is. That's
I'm
why she's
very
such a good moderator and conversationalist.
Well, let's see, because I really want to make sure we have time for questions. Tell us about Mother Goddess. So in 1977, you had an idea for an inflatable Mother Goddess. Just drawing on the left, drawing on the right, actually, realization. It's never been made. Tell us about how this work came to you.
Well, it was interesting because Kalita gave me this book last night called The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagel. And in the early set, which I'm going to give Sarah.
I think it's your earring keeps knocking.
But what?
Your earring keeps knocking your mic.
Okay.
Or hold the earring, one or the other, sorry.
I'll never manage to hold the earring. Okay. I'll forget, and I'll knock the mic.
Apologies. There we go.
Okay. Yeah, in the early 1970s, when I was all involved in the research for the dinner party, I read a lot of the literature that was coming out, including the Elaine Pagel book, about how all early civilizations revered and worshiped goddesses. And then slowly, you can actually trace the rise of patriarchy through the changes in deities. So when I was working on the dinner party, I actually made a little clay porcelain small goddess, which Prospect has resurrected now in these soaps.
Yes.
And in a little bronze sculpture. And at the time, of course, I had read about Nikki de Saint Phal's Han, which I thought was fantastic. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great to, revive the tradition of goddess worship? Because I'm a huge believer in the fact that either we have to conceive divinity as beyond gender or equal gender. As long as we worship a male god, we are basically supporting patriarchy.
Tell us about scale. Tell us a little bit about scale, because probably visually, your model goddess, more than other goddesses, I mean, there are loads of old goddesses out there, is the very famous Venus of Willendorf.
Right. But it's tiny.
And exactly. And interestingly, I think Koons, someday I'll write a paper on it, but having interviewed Jeff Koons and written about his work in the past, he often has a long list of people with whom he's in dialogue. And crazily, I've attended lectures where he listed 40 or more artists with whom he's in dialogue, and not a single one is a woman, which is
But
remarkable.
that doesn't mean he can't rip us off.
Well,
Well, no, the thing.
no, I know. Let me get.
I'm sorry, Sarah.
But basically, and I do think that I have to try to get an audience with him. I'm pretty sure he must have seen the dinner party in Brooklyn when it showed, and he may have been familiar with your work before that. But at the very least, people didn't miss that show in Brooklyn at the time, especially someone like him, so interested in sex and gender. And I think actually understanding his Made in Heaven, like understanding the Celebration series, all that kind of thing, you really have to go towards feminist works of the earlier period to kind of really understand Jeff Koons. Anyhow.
Let me just say one thing, because
yeah.
it just occurred to me, which is the fact, and this is basically, I don't want anybody to ask me if things have changed, okay? Because this tells the entire story. His piece is realized, an addition, and mine is just a concept. And this is in 2019.
And actually, Jeff Koons' Balloon Venus is available in 5 unique colors. And I don't know what the asking price would be, but well in excess of several million. Let's just talk for a moment about the dinner party. I mean, such a monumental installation, not just for a woman, but for any artist of the time. I mean, it is not just a large-scale installation, it is a complete exhibition in which you designed the wall text and the entrance banners and the credits for the many ceramicists and needle
Artisans.
workers who had contributed to its realization. Tell us just in a nutshell, how did this idea come to you? How did it happen?
Well, you saw already that I thought big. I mean, and what I was encountering was a lack of support. However, like I started doing atmospheres, I wanted to get bigger, I couldn't get the support. I started doing big sculpture. I had to destroy some of it. I couldn't get the support. And it was very fortunate that at the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, the women's movement started, because there was an audience like today hungry for images that affirm women. And I had always been interested in collaboration, although I've gone back and forth from collaboration to working alone based on what the work needed. And I don't want to spend too much time on the dinner party because for so long it blocked out the rest of my work. I'm really grateful for the attention it brought me, but I'm also very, very glad that finally the rest of my production is coming into view, because I used to say, I hope I live long enough for people to understand that the dinner party is only one work in a really large body of art. So the dinner party came out of my own discoveries. It was very confusing to me to be told I couldn't be a woman and an artist too, which I was told all the time in the 60s. And I had, as I said before, learned in college in a European history class, according to my professor, who was a very respected historian, the prevailing point of view was that women had never made any contributions. I was a very ambitious young woman. I wanted to make a contribution to art and art history. And so I started looking back to see if other women had encountered the same challenges I was experiencing and how they had overcome them. And I discovered all this information. It was like I used to say, it was like opening Queen Tut's tomb. And it was like one of the reasons that I stayed involved with the dinner party until its goal was achieved, which was permanent housing, because I felt a responsibility to the information that I had discovered and symbolized. And actually, Lee, the dinner party traveled in its first tour and had a viewing audience of 1 million people, but since it's permanent housing in Brooklyn, it accounts for 20% of the traffic, and so there's been another 1.5 million people. So by now it's been seen by probably 2.5 million or 3 million people, taught all over the world. It taught me the power of art. And in fact, on my Instagram the other day, there was a post from an art history professor in New Zealand saying she was bringing her class to see the dinner party.
And small footnote, I have been a big fan of Judy Chicago since I saw the dinner party in Montreal in 1981 when my mother took me as a 16-year-old. And I was a budding feminist, and it's still an inspiration. Just quickly then, the plates, there are 39 plates around the triangular table, and as we move into the present, the plates become more three-dimensional. And so following our 3D liberation theme, I think that's a remarkable aspect of the dinner party. Did you know that from the beginning, that you would have the plates rising up, so to speak?
No, first I was going to do 100 plates, flat plates on the wall. Then I was going to do 25 women who were eaten alive. Then meanwhile, I was working on the early flat images, and then I went to visit a China painter, and she and her family had not eaten at their dining room table for, I don't know, 100 years, no, not that long, because she had done a complete place setting for 12. Every cup, every plate, every bowl, every pitcher she had painted, and she had it as a permanent display on the dining room table, and I'm like, whoa, plates belong on a table. And then once I worked by myself for the first 1.5 years, so I was still formulating the idea, and then as I was still researching, women came into greater relief as we got closer to the present, and so I reflected that with the plates rising up. Then my troubles began. In terms technically.
We'll leave that for later. It's interesting looking at your work through the filter of sculpture, because there is so much virtual space in your two-dimensional works. Your abstractions are very optical. Op art really is integrated into things like Through the Flower, the painting on the left. And then there is a great love of three-dimensionality in your later, this is an embroidery, but based very much. It
actually combines painting and embroidery. It's from a series called Resolutions, A Stitch in Time, that I did from 1994 to 2000 with some of my most accomplished needleworkers. And by the way, actually, like in Through the Flower, this is again, it's always interesting when I talk with you, Sarah. I have insights I never have at other times. It's probably because you're so smart. But actually, my color and like in this painting, has more to do with Serra, pointillism, because this is color opposites and what color opposites do optically. And you have to remember, I grew up looking at Grandjet, and I often say
in Chicago, Serra's famous La Grandjet is in the Art Institute of Chicago.
And I often say that someday some art historian is going to look at my color in relationship to Serra.
Next talk, I'm putting up a Serra.
Really? Anyway, so this is Resolutions reinterprets traditional adages for the future. And this was a time when some right-wing guy named William Bennett was like making a fortune, like with these old adages, which he was using to go backwards, especially on women's issues. And I'm like, you know what? You can use those same adages to go forward. So I tried.
You also have a long history of working with bas-relief and making works on paper three-dimensional. So these...
cast paper.
Cast paper, exactly.
the one, your butterfly,
Yeah.
submerged, and then Double Head with Blue Eye #1 is from your Powerplay series,
series.
which looked at
The construct of masculinity, 30 years before there was queer theory, gender theory. It was met with complete silence until 2012, 10 or 12, I can't remember when, my Santa Fe gallery then wanted to show it, and they were going to do a catalog, and I called up Jonathan Katz cold. He's like the most prominent queer theorist in America. He started the first gay and lesbian studies program at Yale because I thought he was the perfect person to write. And he told when Powerplay was shown in Salon 94, we did a panel in New York that Jonathan was on with Michael Kimmel, who started the first masculinity studies program in America. Anyway, Jonathan was telling this story about how, this was just 2018, how in 2012, I think it was 2012, all his friends said, when he would say he was working on me, they'd say, "Oh, she's such an essentialist." And he says, what a difference 6 years in the Me Too movement has made, because suddenly academics have confronted reality. Yes, gender may be a shifting reality, but not for women when they're raped. They're not raped because of a shifting gender construct. They're raped because they're women.
Yes, well, one of the things I find uncanny about Double Head with Blue Eye #1 is it looks a little bit like Donald Trump. And interestingly, it was oddly his declaration that he could grab any woman, or at least this particular woman, by the pussy, that liberated the word pussy into, newscasters all of a sudden could use the word. And if there's one good thing he did, it might be allowing us to use that word in polite society again, or ever.
Well, actually, in Miami, when Basel did these interviews with me, I was talking about the one thing I agree with Donald Trump about, fake news. Because I have been the victim of fake news, and so is my work.
Yeah.
The idea that the dinner party degrades women, like really fake news, right? The idea that...
Or that it's pornographic, because actually Congress at one point
Right.
did have a conversation about the dinner party. There was some movement to bring it to DC, and
they went
Congress got
crazy.
wind of it, and there are various senators who are still around, I believe.
congressman.
Oh, it was Congress?
Congress,
Sorry,
yeah.
I think
It
one
was-
of those congressmen is now a senator. Anyway, I can't remember.
Probably.
They referred to it as pornographic.
Right. And, when the Birth Project, because it just shows you because we're about to look at the Birth Project, is that right?
Here we go.
Okay, so the Birth Project, this is one work, one needlepoint out of 85 works. There are 85 works in the Birth Project. And one thing I was saying in Basel, and I was talking about some of the work that was up there, because they had a whole wall of Birth Project. Number one, fake news. The Birth Project is needlepoint. Needlepoint is one type of needlework. The Birth Project is embroidery, quilting, macrame, needlepoint, petty point, Philly crochet. It's like a whole range of techniques. So what does it mean when somebody says needlepoint? It means that there's nothing inherently challenging about looking at the technical range in both the dinner party and the Birth Project, because, and in my conversation with Jeffrey Deitch at Basel, our conversation followed a conversation next door where everybody was bemoaning the prices and differential in the auction market, which I know you've talked about. So somebody asked me about it. And I'm like, why is this the focus of our attention? The price differential is the result of the fact that what women do is not considered important. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's just needlepoint. It's all needlepoint. I said, let me tell you about how birth tertiary is done in a small embroidery. I said, birth tear tear was embroidered over my drawing by a woman in Houston named Jane Gady Thompson, who devised a method of stitching to translate my blends, in which she used 9 needles simultaneously, each one like strung with 3 strands of thread, which first of all she had to strip apart because they come in, DMC floss comes in 6 strands, and she had to cut in 18-inch lengths, and then she would systematically thread her needle with a blend, and then she would blend, and when she got to the end of the blend, she'd do it again. Now, let's talk about the amount of time in our history that is given to the paint strokes of the great male painters. Why is equal time not given to the incredible array of needle techniques that women have used for centuries? Because what women do isn't important. I mean, it's reflected in the critical response to my work over the course of years. It's only because there has been significant cultural change that now what used to be, as I say, I went from shit to shinola. What used to be shit is suddenly shinola. But until that changes, until the fact that Franny Jablonski in this needlepoint of the crowning, I used to say when I was doing the birth project, if men had babies, there would be thousands of images of the crowning. And of course there aren't. Anyway, but you know, there's never been any discussion about the technical achievement of this piece, nor has there ever been any art historical look at the fact that around the border, and I decided to use it when Franny was stitching on it, she wrote the names of all 4 of her great-grandmothers and the number of children they had had to commemorate a tradition in her family that she felt connected to and used the piece to
It's amazing,
express.
actually. I find well, I love this series. I particularly like the composition of this work, and the fact that your collaborator in the making of it, who executed your image, included her own family history around the edges, I find very moving, actually, especially given the content of the work.
Well, I tried in my collaborations to make room for my collaborators to have agency.
Yeah. I want to move quickly to ceramics,
Okay.
because we have one of your two-faced Toby mugs on the right, and ceramics are obviously a key part of the dinner party. And ceramics are an example where in different cultures, ceramics have a different status in the hierarchy. So in Asia, the
Right.
art history embraces the whole history of ceramics. It is an elevated medium, unlike here where it's denigrated as a craft. Can you tell us a little about the Toby mug?
Well, the Toby mugs are really taken kind of out of context of the last 10 years of my work, where I've been working in glass, which we'll get to next.
And I can show that picture
Yeah, but
too.
wait. But the point is that I was in one of the reasons I got interested in glass was that when I was working in California in the 60s, I was there when Peter Voulkos and John Mason brought ceramics over from its craft origins into high art. And I found glass at a point where I thought the same thing needed to be done, that glass was kind of embedded in a decorative tradition, and it had this incredible aesthetic potential, just like China painting had, you know, for me when I first discovered it in the 70s. And I wanted to participate in and help bring about bringing glass into a high art context. It's been a real challenge, more of a challenge than ceramics. But anyway, so the series that the Toby mugs come from is a series called the Toby Heads. And it was my second series in glass, and in it I began to bring back some of the techniques I'd used before, like ceramics and bronze. And so like my new project that's gonna open in September at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. It's called The End, a meditation on death and extinction, and it combines glass, ceramic, and bronze. And the Toby mugs, I was doing these heads, and I got very interested in one of the heads I cast, which was a woman named Toby. And then somebody told me about Toby mugs, which are traditional English ceramic cups, and I'm like, how can I not do that? So I did a series of Toby mugs.
And this is our final slide before we open up to questions, so get ready. And maybe we'll take a few questions at a time, and then you can.
Okay. That's a good idea.
And so here we have 2 glass works, very different styles of glass
this is both
pieces.
2 and 3 dimension again. This goes right across, because the one on the left, this is from my first series, which all had to do with hand gestures, because I got interested in how one hand gesture can mean offering or stop, like mean different things. And I got interested in etched glass and cast glass. I started out in 2003. Do you know what Pilchuck is in outside Seattle? It's the glass school that was started by Dale Chihuly. I went there as an artist in residence. When I was studying China painting, I discovered that a lot of the China painters also painted on glass. It's a type of painting that's not known or used much in the glass world. And so I was interested to see if it could be used on etched or cast glass, which they didn't know, and took me a year and a half to find out. But of course, you know, I've often been on the outside edge of technology. I like that. I like pushing the boundaries of materials. So the double clear hand out, hands off is actually 2 panes of glass etched on the inside and painted and fired. And the Grand Flaming Fist, which is 2 feet high, and it's cast actually in Prague. And to understand the technical challenge of Grand Flaming Fist, it was in the kiln annealing for 2 months. And when I painted it, which I spray painted it, it was in the kiln for another week. So the challenge of doing this kind of painting and firing it on glass is really, really fascinating.
And would you say that the appeal of glass for you relates to its transparency and fragility, particularly when you're embracing content that's about power?
Yes, is the answer.
Good, because it's time for questions.
You actually made it on time?
Pretty well. Yeah, so maybe we can entertain a few questions. It would be great to have as many questions as possible. Maybe we can take 2 or 3. Yeah, I see 2 hands over here.
Themselves before they ask
I
the
see
question.
3 hands. So why don't we take them, and then
okay, who are you?
And Judy can answer them.
Or you, Sarah.
Or I can answer them, sure.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful dialogue. I have a question concerning craft, and it's 2-part. First of all, your own role in the work, as your relationship to craft, are you practicing craft? And then secondly, does craft become valorized only when it becomes considered fine art, or can it have its own ontology in its own sense of existence?
Let's just take this question.
Okay.
Again, this is I mean, I'd love to know your answer to this too, Sarah, but again, this is a context question, okay? You cannot separate the way we view craft and the distinction between art and craft out of a historic context, and the fact that what women do has been considered unimportant and what men do has been considered important. And the distinction between art and craft has been a highly gendered distinction. So I myself do not feel like I am capable of totally changing history at that level. What I have tried to do is to bring the same level of rigor I would bring to a spray-painted canvas, to glass, to needlework, to ceramics. And that's my way of trying to deal with that. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Great.
But you didn't introduce yourself, actually. Who are you?
Carissa Taranova, I'm a professor of art history in Dallas.
Thank you. Next.
Judy,
Who
hi.
are
My
you?
name's Heather.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your work and your wisdom. I so appreciate what you've done for quote unquote women's work and craft, as it's often called, and how you've brought this type of media to a broader forum for serious conversation. It's incredible the number of different techniques that you incorporate in some of these works. And not that long ago, I read a reference from Margaret Atwood about quilts in particular being not just quote unquote women's work and these talismans to protect, but also as flags and banners of power and individuality in an otherwise domestic environment where women can both have power but also be endangered. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Can we take another question and then we'll...
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, let's,
Who
in
are
the
you?
interest of lots of questions.
Hi there, my name's Hayden, and I'm a student at Grapevine High School, pretty local. My question is concerning the atmosphere works. It's been said that it could be interpreted as a commentary on the rainbow herbicides like Agent Orange. Is that a valid interpretation? Was that a purpose in making those works?
What's this question?
Well, as I understood it, when you look at the clouds of smoke, you think about Agent Orange and toxic chemicals. There's a negative association for you with the smoke?
I wrote an essay, a research essay recently, and in my research I saw an art historian who was interpreting it as political commentary on the use of those by the U.S.
I mean,
These
Vietnam
are
was...
two different questions, Sarah.
Totally.
We can't answer them in one.
No, I know.
Okay.
Okay, so...
Why don't you take this one? Really, because there's a question that draws on our historic understanding, too.
Well, I would actually just rephrase it as a slightly different question because I don't have an answer. My question would be, Vietnam was going on between 68 and 74 when you were working on the atmospheres. And obviously that was a very important context for us, everyone kind of, all artists at that time. Is there any, and you are in, is there any anti-war commentary in the work?
Well, I would say that the two pieces that you didn't show from that period that are probably the closest that I could never do, well, one I could do because it was in the desert, nobody was there, but I did a piece in a city on a bridge, and it looks exactly like a terrorist attack, and I could never do it today, okay, because I couldn't get permits, like I said I used to. The other one is a piece called Immolation, which I think is actually in that show that just opened in Washington, isn't it, just about artists in the Vietnam War. It's based on two things. It's based on both the self-immolation of the monks in Vietnam during the war, but it's also linked to what used to be called a custom called sati in India, which was a very sanitized way of describing a practice where the in-laws throw the widow into the flames. So there were direct relations between, however, what has been really terrifying, it's kind of like how Powerplay, you know, like when I posted Three Faces of Man with the senators at the Kavanaugh hearing, and it was like just, I hated it. That in the 30 years ago, I painted something that I was watching on television. In the same way, some of my firework smoke pieces, I mean, when I was looking at the pictures of the California wildfires, they look just like some of my atmospheres. So there was definitely both an effort to soften and feminize the landscape, but also a recognition that, like Richard Serra chopping down the redwoods, was an impulse that was going to lead the human race to destroy itself. Now I have to have the other question rephrased.
How would you say, well, I'm not sure what the question was, but I think it had to do with, quilts on the one hand as a feminized and versus flags and banners and the kind of different uses of textiles?
Well, actually, I studied I hope this addresses your question. I studied the history of needlework when I was working on The Dinner Party, and the second book called Embroidering Our Heritage which deals with the runners, actually tells women's history through the runners, because what I learned was that you could see in needlework the same rises and falls in power of women that the plates chronicle. And there's no question, like Opus Anglicanum, which was the high art of the Middle Ages, it was embroidery. And when it was done by men, it was related to money and power and royalty. And then needlework went into the hands of women at the same time that women lost educational rights, and they also lost the opportunity for any art training. And so they became the recipient. In fact, with the Renaissance, there developed this idea that women were incapable of infusing a design with life. Only men could do that. Therefore, women were the recipients of male designs that they would then stitch. So you can definitely needlework and textiles and power is a very important subject.
We have 5 more minutes because we started 5 minutes late, so I'm taking the liberty of commanding another 5 minutes. Let's have a few questions, and sometimes we can roll them together.
Oh, thank you. My name's Paul Hunter. I'm a retired professor. I've forgotten most of what I professed.
Are you glad about that or not?
Oh, I'm so happy.
That means you've changed your mind?
My question is this, that Cleve Jones, in creating the AIDS quilt project, references your dinner party and Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial as directly influential to that memorial. My question is not if you were influenced by Maya Lin.
She's younger than me.
Oh, so yeah.
She wasn't around.
That's right. But what correspondences do you see between her work and yours? And she's done many other things since the Vietnam Memorial.
Yeah, I know.
So would you just tell me what correspondences you would acknowledge?
But first I want to talk about the AIDS quilt, because actually the AIDS quilt started in the Bay Area, and that's where I did the birth project, and that's where the dinner party was premiered. And actually the AIDS quilt doesn't come out so much of the dinner party, but an initiative I started the following year in Houston when the dinner party began to be shown in this kind of grassroots fueled movement around the world. And I was getting ragged on about not including this person and not including that person. And I was running when I had this idea. And I thought, okay, fine, let's do a community-based project where people can do their own quilts, 2 feet on a side, triangular quilts, anybody they want. And that's what influenced the AIDS quilt. And also ended up with Through the Flower, my small nonprofit, having to deal with 700 of these, which finally we gifted to the University of Louisville to take care of. In terms of Maya Lin, I greatly admire her work, but our aesthetic could not be farther apart. She's very abstract and conceptual, and I approach similar content. For example, her most recent work deals with the same subject that The End deals with, extinction and death, but we've approached that very, very differently.
Thank you.
front row here.
Who are you?
My name is Michael Corbin, and I'm an architect and an art collector. Mine is more of a practical question in terms of the glass pieces that were shown. I'm curious, and I guess the crocheted piece where the woman was blending the different colors of thread.
Needlepoint. Oh, no, that was embroidery. The 9 needles, that was
Right.
embroidery. Okay.
Did you make an artwork that had all the colors? I mean, you made that, and then you said, would you please translate this into something that was knitted or crocheted? And the glass, did you draw that, or did he make?
You mean, what's my process?
Please, yes.
Okay, since I've worked in so many techniques, many of which I've done in my own hand, like China painting all the plates in the dinner party, doing drawings for all the needlework. First of all, in the dinner party, I discovered something, it was like a revelation. I cannot sew or stitch, which Donald will attest to, because when we got married 33 years ago, I used to throw away my shirts if the button fell off. And Donald's like, that's the end of that. Okay, but I discovered in the dinner party that even though I can't sew or stitch, I have this unaccountable ability designed for needlework. So that interested me. In terms of how the birth project work was done, or the dinner party runners, or resolutions, all of which combine, as we go along, more openly combine painting and needlework, is that in the birth project, I began to experiment not only with providing the base on which the stitchers worked and the color range and supervising the production, but also then I started exposing the painting and blending painting and needlework so that it was kind of imperceptible. And in glass, all the painting I've done myself, and glass is inherently a collaborative process. I mean, Dale Chihuly had huge teams to create his glass. So like the hands out, hands off, that was etched by some very accomplished etchers in Santa Fe, and then painted from my drawings, and then painted by me. And same thing with the fists. I actually had to go to Prague to supervise the cold work, which is when they take the piece out of the kiln and do the final grinding and shaping of the forms, because their investment process was very crude. And so I had to spend a lot of time with the artisans, helping them make the hands, like do the detailing, because detail is everything in terms of art. I mean, you understand that in terms of architecture. But that's the process I really, really love. I love that process, and I love the process of pushing past the limits of a medium. And it's actually one of the reasons a lot of people have wanted to work with me. Is like, for example, in the end, I worked on the bronzes with probably one of the best metal fabricators I have ever met or ever worked with, and I've cast bronze before. And in one of the 2 reliefs, he was really challenged on the large one. It was like I said to him, I'm gonna really push your limits. And he's like, okay. And then he's like, I'm cursing you every day. But I did it. So I mean that, and I'm gonna miss working with him, because I'm probably not gonna work in bronze anymore. But I love that process. That's where, I'm sure you do too if you're an architect, right?
On that note, our time is up, and I hope you will join me in thanking Judy
And
for
Serra.
sharing
And Serra.
her wonderful. I so love you. I do.
Thank you. Okay, now. Wait. Can Laura, come here. This is Laura Curry. She's the first person who started making absolutely fabulous works, edition works of my work that you could have much more affordable. And she's brought some of those, huh?
Also a lot of different materials.
Also a lot of different materials. And so she's brought some of those dinner party plates and pieces she's been developing. And I'm going to sign them, and Laura's going to be there to help. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.